Hello and welcome to our Lunch and Learn, all about how to increase your income with your impact report. There's a number of different reasons why an organisation may choose to or be required to publish an impact report of some sort, whether that's because they've opted into a third-party verification scheme that requires it, whether they are legally obliged to by their regulator, or whether they just choose to have their own kind of measure of their progress and then communicate that with their customers. But what we've noticed over the last few years is that a lot of companies are publishing their impact reports, whether that's a sustainability report, an impact report, an ESG report, or even an annual report for charities. And a lot of staff resource and time and energy and expense goes into that process to gather that data, pull it together and report on it. And then the process kind of ends there, and there's a bit of a silo between the comms team or the agency and the reporting team. And actually, your impact report is potentially a really strong communications asset that you can bring into your marketing strategy. And that's what we want to explore today. So, Andrew, from an audience perspective, who are the key stakeholder groups that would care about a business's impact report?
If you look at the way that impact reports are currently published and publicised, you're looking at a very, very small audience. And I'd imagine if most people took a look at the number of click-throughs to PDF'd impact reports that they've produced, you'd find that those numbers are very, very small. However, in terms of audience, you are primarily in current formats of let's produce this giant document that says everything that needs to be said. You're probably looking at your most engaged and most sustainability and, for want of a better word, eco-conscious clients or social justice clients. But realistically, that is a very, very small group that will engage. That is for a number of reasons. One, the number of click-throughs to get there. Sustainability reporting isn't usually front and centre in terms of positioning on websites. And if it is, you've got to have a real want to read a 20, 30-page document. As a result, impact reports, the audience that currently reads them is very, very small. And we find this across the board, including things like annual reporting for charities and also ESG reporting. ESG reporting obviously has its own audience built in, so does annual reporting because they are structurally necessary and regulated documents, or at least overseen by regulators. So when it comes to an impact report, the audience is your most engaged and most caring client base. But at the same time, it shouldn't be, because that defies the purpose of purpose to some extent.
They can be really useful documents in terms of your supply chain relationships, and that's probably going to become more significant as things like mandatory Scope 3 emissions reporting comes into effect, and as that filters down by business size. So your suppliers and the people in your supply chain and the people that you're procuring into your business are going to care more about that impact. Your investors are obviously a key audience, especially on the ESG side of things. But really, you're right, Andrew, this is a very small stakeholder group, or very small groups of stakeholders, and people aren't really, although they're publishing their impact reports publicly, let's be honest, as consumers, without kind of an interest in sustainability, so the general audience of consumers, how often are we going and finding these impact reports and reading them before we make our purchasing decision? They're not really used in that sales process, and they're not really used significantly in marketing, other than companies saying, we've just published our impact report. And as you said, people then not clicking through and reading that. But they could be a really valuable marketing tool.
I completely agree, and we've done client work with major charities that have taken things like annual reporting and ESG reporting and looked at the information contained in those reports that we've effectively produced for them, and then broken that down into bite-sized chunks, not only for internal communications for large charities and businesses, but also for external communications, because you can highlight the good work of your staff but you can also highlight, if you're a smaller company, your general good work by actually telling people, if you've done all of the work in your impact report to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you have achieved those things, that is the information the regulators want you to share. That is Green Claims Code compliant fundamentally. If you've already proved it, that's what you should be talking about. And it's one of the ways we avoid green hushing. So we've done this a couple of times. Well, we did this a couple of times in 2023 and a few times before that. But it is becoming a very viable way of, one, producing data that is Green Claims Code compliant. Two, actually, if you design your reports correctly, creating the graphics for use on socials, the use in ads, etc. If your reports are designed the right way, that can all be pre-built in, and then it's content through process to create a campaign, a pre-scheduled campaign off the back of that. And really, we were talking last week about the idea of purpose and where it sits in the messaging hierarchy. Where purpose is strongest is where you can prove what you're doing. But very few organisations are leveraging those impact reports as proof and breaking them down into bite-sized consumer sections. I mean, one of the things you said last week, Sean, was about the idea that dwell time on videos and imagery on social media is not very high for a lot of brands. And one of the ways you can improve that is by putting your purpose messaging in a wider messaging hierarchy and using those core messages that you're spending all that time and all that energy outlining and getting just right in your impact reports. Why not use those as part of a marketing strategy so that you are pushing your wins, you are pushing what your company does, and you're doing it, one, as an impact campaign when you launch your impact report, and also throughout the rest of the year. One of the big things that many people may not be aware of is the role that annual reports play in how charities fundraise. Charity fundraisers are very highly reliant on those annual reports because that is where the messaging is set for the year. That is the voice that the organisation, the charity, has chosen and what it's chosen to talk about, and also contains all of the statistics, etc., for those fundraisers. And again, when we talked last week, we talked about the idea of purpose messaging being fundamentally an evolution of charity messaging and the way charities do it in terms of fundraising. And there's a direct correlation as to that evolution. So why not start to take on board some of those other techniques around harnessing these big documents in such a way as to validate the legitimacy of your claims, but not only your claims, but also market perception of your company, charity, whatever it may be, that actually it's not overly complex to take that information and rework it into a campaign that consistently and regularly pushes your purpose messaging without making it the top of your messaging hierarchy.
I think that's a really good comparison to draw on larger charities that have large fundraising teams or even medium-sized fundraising teams, and how reliant they are on the annual reporting process and how that becomes such an asset to that process and to those communications. And really, I think what it comes down to is stakeholder mapping across your different audience groups, and then your messaging hierarchy, as you said. So we know that if you go out there into the big wide world of social media and just start talking about your purpose all the time as your primary message, even with that evidentiary basis, even with those case studies and those stories and testimonials and things from your impact reporting process, you are at risk of triggering the attitude behaviour gap if you are trying to sell a product or service. So there are limitations to how the fundraising analogy runs, because obviously getting people to donate is a different emotional journey to some extent than getting them to buy a product. You really need to focus more on the benefits to them of the actual product if you're selling something to them. But in a messaging hierarchy, you can build that purpose messaging and that evidentiary basis and those stories and that positive impact into the customer journey and into the sales funnel. And where we see brands get this wrong a lot of the time is that they are so passionate about their purpose and all of the effort they've put in to building the relationships to bring that to life, finding the suppliers, being as sustainable and eco-friendly as possible, that's all they want to talk about, especially when they are challenger brands and they're newer to the market. That's what they want to talk about. That's what they think their USP is. But actually, if you shift that messaging down the funnel and you capture people's attention and their desire to buy based on the benefits of your product or your service, and then start building your purpose messaging in, that's when it can become really, really effective. And in behavioural science, we talk a lot about the peak end rule. So when we remember experiences, such as eating out at a restaurant, for example, we don't remember it in a linear fashion. We remember the best moment in that experience and how we felt at the end of that experience. And where we're seeing brands have a lot of success with their impact messaging is using it to create that peak and to use it at the end to create that goodwill and that talkability around your brand. So actually shifting it from the top of your funnel to post-purchase and talking about the impact that your customers have helped you create by making that purchase. You leave them with that really good feeling that they've done something good with their money. You help to alleviate that initial feeling we get of, I've just spent money and I don't like to lose things and my product hasn't arrived yet, so there's a behavioural gap there. You alleviate that by making them feel good about the impact, and you can roll that into an ongoing campaign to build brand loyalty over time. We see brands like Karma Cola do this really well. For example, when they release their impact report, all of the messaging around it is directed at their customers and what you have helped us achieve as a brand. And I think realistically, if you want to engage customers in your impact, you really need to be thinking about where it sits in your funnel so that it's not harming your sales, but it is building your community around your brand loyalty, and it's giving people something to go and tell their friends about so that they become an extension of your marketing team.
You make a very interesting point that it is fundamentally the customers that make the impact, because although any business can set up and do the very difficult work of finding the right suppliers, etc., unless somebody's buying it, unless somebody's buying your product, you don't maintain and grow that impact. And especially in things like FMCG and the services sectors, if you're not selling your services, then you're not having the impact. You may have the systems and processes in place, but if that loop isn't closed, then the impact doesn't increase or doesn't happen. Which, when you extend to the idea of impact reporting, shows you very clearly that it is your existing customer you should be telling first and foremost about the impact they have had, because by buying your product, they have had an impact. And linking those two together in a compliant way is a very powerful way of doing that, rather than sending a 30-page, here's our impact report. Breaking that down into 3 to 5 general statistics, very similar, and I hate to say it, but BrewDog do this very well. Breaking it down to 3 to 5 statistics and being very, very clear with that impact. The other great example of that is, in terms of the peak end rule, is the way that the government explains how it spends your tax money. Once a year, just before you have to pay your tax bill, you get a piece of paper that says this is how we've spent your money. It's all broken down by percentages. But that reassures people as to how the government is spending their money, and behaviourally speaking made a huge difference in normal people understanding what the government does and what it's for. And again, it's fundamentally peak end rule. The point of that, though, is that target your existing customers with your impact messaging, because it's their impact too. Make it easy and accessible, and then build it in to general campaigning. Again, it's back to the idea of hierarchy, that actually messaging hierarchy is all about who you're talking to, what they need, and where they are.
One of the best platforms that is really underutilized for communicating your impact is email marketing. So a lot of particularly FMCG brands will do the typical 10% off to join our mailing list, and then they will only really email that list when they've got a sale on, or when they're pushing a sales period like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or Christmas, for example. And they struggle with what to say in the gaps in between. And I know a lot of smaller challenger companies often feel guilty about sending too many emails and get really worried about being in people's inboxes and seen as spammy. And actually, your impact report, when broken down into those key messages and when framed as this is the impact that you're helping us to create, can be a real asset to your email marketing strategy. It's really important to remember that with email, those are your VIPs, your highest engaged customers and potential customers. And you should always segment out by who has purchased from you and who hasn't yet, and tailor your communications and your journey appropriately. But those are the people that are opting in to allow you into their space. They're saying they want to hear from you regularly. They want those discounts, but they also want to get to know you as a brand. And actually, your impact report and the stories within it can be broken down to really help build that relationship. And that starts to shape up as a really nice campaign, because we know with email, the key to success there is one message per email, and maintaining roughly a 70-30 ratio of storytelling to sales content. We've seen really significant results. We recently took an FMCG brand and revamped their entire email strategy and increased their revenue by 67%. And they had a lot, and that was just in 3 months. And they had a lot of impact messaging in there, but it was very mixed. It wasn't broken down. It wasn't utilizing the storytelling techniques and building that relationship with their subscribers. And you could see that when you mapped out the journey and the funnel as to where people were dropping off and where they weren't converting to sales. And actually, when we started taking the information from their impact report and breaking that down into messages that we know their subscribers wanted to hear about, and frame it in a way that they would care about it and make it relevant to them, that was one of the big factors in increasing that revenue from that channel.
I think you're absolutely right, Sean. There are multiple ways to communicate impact that are more effective than the report itself. And I think one of the things that I would make clear at this point is that when we look at designing things like that, we design with content through process in mind. Organizational driven content, that is, we are collecting this because we have either a regulatory obligation or have agreed to do something like publish an impact report every year. If you're going to do that, why not design it so it is fundamentally a marketing campaign? Why not design it so that it's one, compliant, and two, can be easily broken down into parts and used for other content? Why design this fancy document with very expensive designers to make look very, very pretty, and then find that nobody ever reads the thing? Why not create the document because that's your obligation, but design it in such a way that it becomes a marketing campaign, that it becomes an email campaign, that it becomes, that data gets built into your sales funnels, that you can then renew that data in each of those places every year, and it forms an underlying part of everything you do because it's pre-scheduled in, it is the messaging that you have agreed for the year, and this is exactly how charities do it. Obviously, Sean's absolutely right that the problem with purpose is that with charities, it works very well because those highly emotionally charged elements work very well for raising money and not very well for selling goods and services. But at the same time, you can build that in as a positive, especially using something like an impact report, where fundamentally you are presenting the positives of your business in a compliant and regulatory sensible way.
And this is really why it's essential to have your comms people, whether that's an external agency or your in-house team, involved in that reporting process. Don't just have it land on their desk at the point where it needs designing, it needs turning into that beautiful PDF. actually involve them in crafting the document, collecting the data, because your compliance team will be looking at the data from this is our regulatory framework, this is what we've got to say, and this is how we present it. Obviously, your finance team might need to be involved as well if it's an ESG report, but your comms team will be able to feed in from this is our brand positioning, this is the story that we want to tell, and they will be looking at that evidence to see what can support those stories and what they can pull out and where they can add in testimonials, case studies, examples from the people that you're helping or the projects that you're supporting, and they can be involved in going out and getting that information. So this isn't necessarily about creating more work, it's actually about streamlining the reporting process, involving people earlier so it doesn't become a siloed activity. And if you do that, you can then build in the content through process that Andrew's talking about, and ensuring that at the end you not only have a compliant regulatory document, you also have a campaign to go with it and messaging that will fit year round into your brand strategy as you do your brand building.
So, Sean, that brings us on to how to harness an impact report effectively to actually encourage sales and increase income. What are your initial thoughts on that?
The starting point is really going back to your sales funnel and looking at where your purpose messaging sits. Like we said before, we focused already on kind of the bottom of your funnel and the high converting messaging and the post-purchase messaging. That's not to say that there isn't a place for your impact report messaging and case studies and data to appear on your social media and to be used in your media engagement and PR strategy. It's just about tailoring those messages and using that carefully. Now, if you're a small team, this can feel very overwhelming because, and this is usually why people publish the report and that's the end of it, because a lot of effort goes into creating that report. You put it out there and then you're on to what's next. But actually, if you map out your calendar for the year and your sales funnel and where your different interventions, so your social media, your email marketing, your PR, where that's all sitting in your customer journey, it can become a real asset because it creates the messaging for you. So this isn't about going into your impact report and creating new message about the report. It's about taking the content of the report and filling the message gaps in your calendar with that messaging and thinking about how your different stakeholders are going to respond to that. So it is one of the things that the media are potentially going to be interested in. But again, where a lot of brands get it wrong is they send out a press release about their impact report and the fact that they've published one. And that in itself is not newsworthy. So it's going through your impact report and the data and the information with a PR lens to find the newsworthy stories within that. It is a little bit more work, but that, if you do it right, will give you your PR strategy for the year, because it will give you the key foundations of your messaging that when there is a moment that you want to capture in the news, you can then build that in and weave that messaging in and pitch that to the media and engage them. And you know that it's Green Claims Code compliant because the evidentiary basis is there in the report. Same on your social media and with your ads. If you're thinking about adding video to your strategy, for example, to meet the engagement requirements for the algorithm, there will be a whole host of stories that you can tell within your impact report that you can start pulling out and creating that content. And you're not having to then go and think about a whole new messaging strategy. It's just being mindful that the way that you're telling that story needs to be engaging to your end audience. And actually, the story isn't that you've published an impact report, it's that they have helped you make the impact that you are reporting on.
I couldn't agree more, Sean. I'd also add that things like awareness days write themselves if you know what impact you're already having. And when you're designing the report, if you actually think to yourself, right, okay, we are doing this specific area that aligns to these awareness days, aligns to these SDGs, you are already producing content for those days. So you're not increasing workload, you're just reusing the messaging that you've actually spent time on, because an impact report takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and using that information and harnessing it for those key moments where you are most impactful and where you already do the most good, and highlighting those in a compliant way is fundamentally what impact reports are for. So why not use it in a way that talks to the consumer and becomes a touch point in the trust process for buying?
And I think it's really important to remember that that isn't your conversion messaging. So it's still important to have that balance of talking about your product, talking about your service, and how it benefits the end consumer. But actually, the impact reporting messaging and the stories that you want to tell there, if you use them in the right way, such as awareness days, if you've made impact for the ocean and it's World Oceans Day, tell that story at that moment with those hashtags in the right places where your customers are going to be engaging with that, and you will bring them into your sales funnel. So on its own, it's not necessarily an income generating tool, but the process of embedding it into your comms strategy is what makes it part of the conversion journey and part of the sales process. And actually, if you take this methodology that we're talking about and use content through process, or have an agency do it for you, that's where you start to see results from your impact reporting, rather than just publishing the report as something that you have to do or you feel you have to do, and actually not seeing that level of engagement and uptick from your audience as a result of it. So Andrew, in terms of putting this into practice, what are the next steps for any brands that are watching that are going to be preparing their impact report this year?
I would suggest not looking at it as a giant shiny report that fundamentally very few people are ever going to read, but instead looking at it as the foundations of the next 12 months of your purpose messaging and how that fits within your sales funnels, etc. And concentrating on using that document not just as a document that needs to be created, but as a way of setting your purpose messaging to your core audiences for the next 12 months, and then embedding that in all of your communications.
And that brings us to the end of this Lunch and Learn. Do make sure you follow our LinkedIn page and check out the events there to see what else we've got